The first thing you felt in Dry Creek wasn't the heat. It was the silence. A thick, heavy silence that clung to the bleach-bone buildings like a shroud. This was a town where folks had mastered the art of looking away, of pretending not to see, of letting silence swallow the things that needed screaming about. And on this particular Tuesday, the silence was about to be broken. Abigail Hayes knew he was coming. She didn't need to hear the stumbling boots on the hard-packed earth outside her kitchen window. She felt it, a cold dread that lived permanently in her gut. The door didn't open. It exploded inward, slamming against the wall so hard the only picture she owned, a faded photo of her parents, jumped on its nail. Jedediah filled the doorway, a giant of a man, made bigger by whiskey and rage. The stench of it rolled in ahead of him, sour and mean. "Woman," he slurred, his eyes struggling to find her. "Supper." Abigail didn't turn from the wash basin. She'd learned that lesson years ago. Meeting his eyes was like throwing gasoline on a spark. "It's on the stove, Jedediah. Keeping warm." A crash of pottery told her the plate was now on the floor. "Cold slop. Can't even keep a man's meal proper." She closed her eyes, her hands gripping the edge of the basin, knuckles white. She braced herself. She knew the steps to this dance by heart. The rough hand tangled in her hair, yanking her head back with savage force. Pain, sharp and blinding, shot down her spine. Her hip cracked against the corner of the table, but she refused to cry out. A whimper, a tear. That was victory to him. It was fuel. "You're coming with me," he snarled, his breath hot and foul against her cheek. He started dragging her, her bare feet scraping against the rough-hewn floorboards. "Gonna show this whole town what happens to a wife who can't do nothing right." The merciless Arizona sun hit her like a physical blow as he hauled her out of the cabin and into the main street. The dust and gravel tore at her knees, ripping her thin dress. She tasted blood where she'd bitten her tongue, and through the haze of pain and utter humiliation, she saw them. The good people of Dry Creek. They stopped what they were doing. Mrs. Milligan, outside the mercantile, her basket of goods forgotten. The Fletcher boys, their game of marbles abandoned, their young faces a mixture of fear and fascination. Every window seemed to hold a pair of eyes. Every doorway, a silent witness. Even Sheriff Dalton, the man paid to keep the peace, suddenly found something incredibly interesting to study in the dirt at his feet. The tin star on his vest seeming to mock the very idea of justice. "Look at her!" Jedediah's voice was a roar that echoed off the storefronts. He gave her hair another vicious yank, and a sickening, wrenching feeling came from her shoulder. "My wife, useless as a three-legged mule." He was putting on a show. He needed an audience for his cruelty. "Can't cook, can't clean," he bellowed, his voice thick with self-pity. Then he delivered the blow he knew would cut the deepest. "Can't even give a man no sons." The words hit her harder than his fist ever could. She thought of the 3 tiny, unmarked graves on the hill outside of town. 3 little heartbreaks he'd forbidden her to even visit, as if their loss was her failure alone. The whole town was watching, paralyzed, complicit in their silence. But then, through her tangled, dusty hair, Abigail saw something different. A figure standing in the deep shadow of the livery stable. Unlike the others, this man wasn't looking away. He was tall, broader than Jedediah, built like he was carved from mountain oak. His face was a mask of beard and shadow, hidden by the brim of a battered hat. But she could see his eyes. They were gray as a winter storm, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. He wasn't looking at her with pity or disgust or fear. He was just watching, bearing witness. And in that moment, Abigail felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a very, very long time. It wasn't hope. It was something sharper. It was defiance. The mountain man's name was Elias Boone. He'd come down from the high country 3 days ago, a ghost leading a mule laden with furs. He was a man who lived by the rules of the wilderness, not the flimsy laws of towns like this. He'd seen cruelty before. He'd seen men torn apart over gold claims and water rights. He'd seen the casual brutality of nature. But this was different. This wasn't a wolf taking a deer. This was a man trying to extinguish a soul while a town of so-called decent folk stood by and held his coat. It stirred a memory in Elias, sharp and bitter as bile. Another woman, another town, another time he had stood in the shadows and done nothing. Her name had been Sarah, and her ghost was never far from his thoughts. "Ain't worth the feet it takes to keep her," Jedediah finally roared, concluding his performance. He released his grip, and Abigail collapsed into the street, a heap of torn fabric and quiet dignity. "Any man wants her can have her. Save me the trouble." The silence that followed was deafening. No one moved. Not the church women who spoke of charity every Sunday. Not the cowboys who boasted of their honor in the saloon. Slowly, painfully, Abigail pushed herself up. First to her knees, then, swaying slightly to her feet. Each movement was a deliberate act of rebellion. She didn't look at her husband, who was already stumbling toward the saloon. She didn't look at the crowd, which was now beginning to disperse, its entertainment over for the day. She just started the long, lonely walk back to her cabin. Elias Boone watched her go. He saw the impossible straightness of her spine, the way she held her chin up, even as her body screamed in pain. He saw a flame in a hurricane, refusing to be put out. He should leave. He should pack his mule and ride back to the clean, simple world of the mountains, where a man didn't have to watch evil triumph while good men did nothing. That was the smart thing to do. That was the safe thing to do. But as he stood there in the shadows, he couldn't shake the image of her defiant eyes, and he couldn't forget the taste of his own cowardice, bitter and familiar. He had failed Sarah all those years ago. He had stood by and let her die. He looked at Abigail's retreating form, and then he looked at the saloon where Jedediah had disappeared. The mountains would wait. He had a ghost to put to rest. That night, sleep wouldn't come to Elias. He'd made a cold camp in the hills overlooking Dry Creek, the town a scatter of faint lights below. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw two faces, Sarah from his past, already lost, and Abigail, from his present, still fighting. He was a man who had intentionally walled himself off from the world. The mountains were his fortress. Solitude was his shield. He'd convinced himself he didn't care about the petty cruelties of so-called civilization, but he had seen Abigail's eyes, and in them he'd recognized a strength he hadn't seen since Sarah. The memory clawed at him. Sarah McKenna, the wife of a wealthy railroad baron, a man named Theodore, who'd hired Elias as a guide for a hunting trip. Theodore had soft hands and a cruel streak a mile wide. Elias had seen the bruises on Sarah, had heard the whispered insults, the sharp slaps when Theodore thought no one was around. Elias had told himself it wasn't his business. A man didn't interfere between a husband and wife. That's what he told himself. That was the lie he used to justify his silence. On the last night of the trip, fueled by expensive brandy, Theodore had gone too far. Elias heard Sarah scream, a sound of pure terror that cut through the night. He'd run to their tent, his heart pounding, but he hesitated at the flap. Just for a second. That 1 second of cowardice cost Sarah her life. When he finally burst in, Theodore was standing over her. She'd fallen, her head striking the iron stove. She looked at Elias as she died, and her eyes held no accusation, just a deep, soul-crushing disappointment. She had never expected anyone to help her. Theodore's money had bought him a story about a tragic accident, and Elias had walked into the mountains and never looked back, until now. Now fate, or God, or the devil himself had presented him with a second chance, a chance he knew he didn't deserve. Down in the town, Jedediah Hayes was likely drinking himself into a stupor, celebrating his public display of dominance. And in her small, dark cabin, Abigail Hayes was tending her wounds, alone. Elias knew what he had to do. He couldn't just ride away this time. The ghost of Sarah McKenna wouldn't allow it. He couldn't challenge Jedediah directly. That would only get him hanged or get Abigail hurt worse. No, this had to be quiet, subtle, a war fought in the shadows. He was a hunter, after all. He knew how to watch, how to wait, how to set the perfect trap. Jedediah Hayes thought he had won. He thought he had broken his wife and reasserted his power over the town. He had no idea that a ghost had just declared war on him. The morning after always came too soon. Abigail moved through her kitchen like a phantom, her body a roadmap of new and old bruises. She set Jedediah's breakfast on the table, biscuits and gravy, and he shoveled it into his mouth without a word, his head pounding from the night's liquor. "Coffee's weak," he grunted. "I'll make it stronger tomorrow," she replied, her voice a carefully constructed monotone. After he left, she allowed herself a single, shuddering breath. The knock on her door was soft, hesitant. It was Clara Morrison, one of the church women, holding a basket. "Brought you some preserves," Clara said, her eyes flitting around the cabin, unable to land on Abigail's bruised face. "About yesterday, we all saw, that is," she trailed off, her courage failing her. "Thank you for the preserves, Clara," Abigail said, her voice quiet but firm. It was both a dismissal and a forgiveness. What else was there to say? "I saw you turn away. I saw you do nothing." After Clara fled, Abigail sat holding the jar of peach preserves. She wouldn't eat them. They would go to sweeten Jedediah's breakfast. But she held the jar up to the light, watching the golden fruit glow like captured sunshine. This was the language of the women of Dry Creek, small, silent gestures of sympathy that cost them nothing. They'd done the same for Lucy Garrett, whose husband had been just like Jedediah. They'd left pies on her doorstep right up until the day they found her hanging in the barn. The whispers followed Abigail everywhere she went. She must have provoked him. A good wife knows how to keep a man happy. She holds herself too high, that one. She had learned to move through the whispers, to keep her face a placid mask, to give them nothing. Her daily rituals, sweeping the porch, tending her small, stubborn garden, were her only rebellion. But 2 days later, something changed. She opened her door at dawn to fetch water and found a perfectly stacked cord of firewood on her porch. Split pine, cut to the perfect size for her stove. Jedediah hadn't split wood in years. It wasn't from a neighbor. This was an act of silent, deliberate labor. She stared at the wood, her heart beginning to pound. It felt like a trap, but it also felt like something else. She carried it inside, piece by piece. The sharp, clean scent of pine filled her small cabin, a smell of forests and freedom. When Jedediah saw it that night, he grunted. "Where'd this come from?" "It was just there," she said, a half-truth. He shrugged, too absorbed in his own misery to question it further. Some fool must have left it at the wrong house. Their loss. But Abigail knew it wasn't a mistake. It had been left for her. Someone had seen her struggle with the heavy axe. Someone had noticed. 3 days after that, a fresh haunch of venison, expertly butchered and wrapped in clean cloth, was hanging from a nail by her door. She smuggled it inside, her hands trembling. Meat was a luxury they couldn't afford. She had to be careful, cutting it into small pieces and hiding it in stews so Jedediah wouldn't get suspicious. He ate it without comment, never noticing the new richness of his meals. A week later, it was a bundle of soft rabbit pelts, perfect for lining her worn-out boots against the coming winter, tucked behind the rain barrel. And with the pelts came a certainty. It was him, the mountain man, Elias Boone. The knowledge should have terrified her. A strange man leaving secret gifts, watching her from the shadows. It was dangerous. If Jedediah found out, he would kill them both. But it didn't feel dangerous. It felt like a lifeline. The gifts weren't romantic or foolish. They were practical. Wood for warmth, meat for strength, furs for comfort. They were the gifts of a man who understood survival. They were a silent message. You are not alone. She started looking for him, catching glimpses of him in town. A tall figure leaning against the blacksmith's wall. A shadow disappearing into an alley. Their eyes met once across the dusty town square. A long, silent moment of acknowledgement. Then she looked away, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had to let him know she understood, that she was grateful. That night, after Jedediah had passed out in his chair, she baked a small loaf of bread, using some of the flour she'd been carefully saving. She wrapped it in the same cloth the venison had come in and left it on the porch, a silent offering in return. The next morning, the bread was gone. In its place sat a tiny, exquisitely carved wooden bird, its wings spread as if in mid-flight. Abigail picked it up, her rough fingers tracing the delicate lines. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever held. It served no purpose. It wasn't for warmth or for food. It was just For her. She hid the little bird in her sewing box, a secret talisman, a promise. The townsfolk started to notice a change in her, a straighter spine, a spark of life in her eyes. The bruises began to fade, and no new ones appeared to replace them. Jedediah was still mean, still drunk. But something had shifted. Maybe it was her own newfound confidence, a subtle change in her demeanor that threw him off his usual rhythm of cruelty. But the gifts had also been noticed by someone else, someone with mean, suspicious eyes. Jedediah wasn't a smart man, but he wasn't a complete fool either. He knew the woodpile hadn't appeared by magic. He knew the taste of venison, even in a stew. He started watching her. His questions became more pointed, his accusations more venomous. "Someone's been sniffing around, ain't they?" He'd growl, his eyes narrowed. "Think I don't know? Think I can't smell another man's charity in my own house?" Abigail denied everything, her stomach twisting into knots of fear. Not for herself, for the silent man in the mountains. The delicate dance of secret gifts and silent thanks had become a deadly game, and Jedediah was getting closer and closer to discovering the truth. The wooden bird in her sewing box no longer felt just like a promise. It felt like a countdown to an explosion. The blue dress was a mistake. Abigail knew it the moment she saw the bolt of fabric in the mercantile. It was the color of a twilight sky, deep and full of promise. She was just looking, just allowing herself a moment to dream, when she felt a presence behind her. It was Elias. He was so close she could feel the heat from his body, could smell the scent of pine and cold mountain air that clung to him. "That's quality cloth," he said, his voice a low rumble, meant only for her. "The blue would suit you." Before she could answer, he was gone, moving to the other side of the store to buy ammunition. But when she looked down, a silver dollar was sitting on the bolt of blue fabric, exactly enough for 3 yards. Her mind screamed at her to leave it, to walk away. Accepting it was crossing a line. It was reckless. It was inviting disaster. She bought the fabric. She told herself it was an act of defiance. For one day she wanted to feel like a woman, not a beast of burden. She stayed up all night sewing, her fingers flying, the wooden bird sitting on the table beside her. The dress was simple, but it was perfect. She wore it to church that Sunday. The whispers were louder than ever, the stares more pointed. Where did Jedediah's wife get a new dress? Clara Morrison gave her a look that was equal parts admiration and terror. Jedediah was too hungover to notice that morning, but that evening, his whiskey-addled brain finally connected the dots. The wood, the meat, the whispers, and now the dress. "Where'd you get the money for that?" he demanded, his voice dangerously quiet. "I saved it," she lied, her voice barely a whisper. "Liar!" The back of his hand caught her across the face, snapping her head to the side. "There ain't no extra. Someone's been giving you things. Who is it?" He grabbed her, shaking her like a rag doll. His fingers dug into her arms, leaving bruises she knew would be shaped like his grip. "Is it that boy from the feed store? Tom Martinez? I seen the way he looks at you." "No one," she gasped, the lie sticking in her throat. "Is it one of the miners? You whoring for them behind my back?" The accusation was so vile it momentarily eclipsed the pain. She found a strength she didn't know she had. "I am your wife," she said, her voice shaking with a rage that matched his. "I have never dishonored that." He shoved her away, sending her stumbling into a chair. He didn't hit her again. He just stood there, breathing heavily, his eyes scanning the small cabin as if seeing it for the first time. He was a hunter now, too, sniffing the air, looking for a trail. "I'll find out who it is," he promised, his voice a low, venomous hiss. "And when I do, I'll kill him. Then I'll deal with you." The game was over. Jedediah was on the warpath. He spent the next day at the saloon, not just drinking, but talking, asking questions, offering whiskey to any man who had seen anything unusual. He was piecing it together, his drunken paranoia sharpened into a weapon. Abigail moved through town in a fog of terror. She had to warn Elias. She had to tell him to run, to go back to his mountains and never come back. Her foolishness with the dress had signed his death warrant. She saw him late that afternoon, leading his mule toward the livery. He was leaving town. Relief and a sharp, unexpected grief warred within her. He was smart. He knew the danger. Their eyes met across the street. He saw the fresh bruise on her cheek. He saw the terror in her eyes. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. Go. Don't come back. It's not safe. He gave a slow nod and tipped the brim of his hat. An acknowledgement. A farewell. She watched him disappear into the livery stable, a hollow ache spreading through her chest. It was better this way. It was the only way. That night, Jedediah came home surprisingly sober. He was cleaning his old Colt revolver, the lamplight glinting on the oiled steel. Funny thing, he said, not looking at her. Ran into that mountain man at the saloon. Boone. Had a little talk with him. Man. Abigail's blood ran cold. Told him this town ain't big enough for the both of us. Jedediah continued, a cruel smile playing on his lips. Told him what happens to men who poach on another man's property. I think he got the message. He spun the cylinder of the Colt. Click, click, click. The sound was like a hammer on an anvil. He's gone, Jedediah said with satisfaction. Rode out an hour ago. Headed back to whatever hole he crawled out of. Abigail kept her eyes on the sock she was darning, her stitches small and tight, anchoring her to the moment, keeping her from shattering into a million pieces. He was gone. He was safe. That's what mattered. But as Jedediah's triumphant snores filled the small cabin, Abigail sat by the window, staring at the dark, jagged line of the mountains. She felt utterly, completely alone. She took the small wooden bird from its hiding place. Its wings were spread, ready for flight. But her own wings had just been broken. The silence that returned to her life was heavier than ever before. The silence of before had been one of resignation. This new silence was one of loss. The secret hope that had sustained her was gone, chased away by a drunk with a gun and a threat. Days turned into a week. Jedediah, emboldened by his victory, was worse than ever. His cruelty was no longer just a drunken rage. It was calculated, a constant reminder of his power over her. The town settled back into its comfortable cowardice. The whispers died down. The show was over. Abigail moved through her life like a ghost once more. She had tasted a moment of kindness, and now the memory of it was a constant, bitter torment. She had been a fool to believe things could change. She had been a fool to wear a blue dress. She didn't know that Elias Boone had not gone back to the mountains. He had ridden out of town, yes, but he had circled back under the cover of darkness. He was camped in a hidden ravine just a few miles away, a place where he could see the light in her cabin window. He was a patient man. He was a hunter, and he was waiting for Jedediah to make his final mistake. The storm didn't just arrive, it attacked. One moment, the sky was a blistering, cloudless blue. The next, it was the color of a fresh bruise, churning with a furious energy. Rain came down in solid, blinding sheets, turning the dust of Dry Creek's main street into a river of mud. Abigail stood at her window, watching lightning tear the sky apart. Jedediah had been at the saloon. The storm had driven him home early, and he'd brought the bar's rage with him. "This is your fault," he roared, stumbling through the door, soaked and furious. In his mind, she was the source of all his misfortunes. The storm, his losing streak at cards, the lingering humiliation of the mountain man's interference. "Get out here," he snarled, grabbing her wrist with a grip of iron. He dragged her out into the tempest. The icy rain was a shock, plastering her thin dress to her skin in seconds. The mud sucked at her bare feet. "Jedediah, please!" Her words were swallowed by a clap of thunder. He hauled her to the center of the town square, a stage for his final, terrible performance. Lights were on in the saloon, the mercantile. Faces appeared in the windows, ghostly figures drawn to the chaos. "Look at her!" he screamed into the wind, his voice cracking with madness. He threw her to the ground. She landed hard on her knees in the thick, cold mud. "The wife who shames me. The whore who takes gifts from strange men." A flash of lightning illuminated the scene for the whole town to see. Abigail, a pathetic, mud-caked figure on her knees. Jedediah, a monster of rage standing over her. And the silent, watching faces in the windows. He grabbed her hair, yanking her head back until her neck screamed in protest. The rain streamed down her face, mixing with the mud. She would not give him the satisfaction of tears. "Nobody makes a fool of Jedediah Hayes," he howled. "Nobody!" And that's when a new figure stepped out of the storm. He seemed to materialize from the rain and shadows, a man as elemental and untamed as the storm itself. Tall, broad, moving with a calm, deliberate purpose that was more terrifying than Jedediah's rage. Lightning flashed again, lighting up the hard lines of Elias Boone's face. He had come back. "Let her go, Hayes." His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the roar of the wind and rain. It was the voice of finality, the voice of judgment. Jedediah spun around, his hand instinctively going for the Colt at his hip. I told you to get out of my town." "This isn't your town," Elias said, stopping 10 feet away, his hands open and visible at his sides. "And that is not your property. That is a woman. Let her go." "Or what?" Jedediah's laugh was a raw, ugly sound. "You gonna shoot me? They'll hang you for it." "There are other ways to settle this," Elias said, his voice dropping, becoming more dangerous. "Unless, of course, you only have the courage to fight women and unarmed boys." He was talking about Tom Martinez, the boy from the feed store. Jedediah had cornered the boy a few days earlier, accusing him, roughing him up. Jedediah had thought no one saw, but Elias saw everything. The insult hit Jedediah harder than a fist. With a roar of pure fury, he shoved Abigail aside and drew his gun. He was fast, but Elias was a different kind of fast. He moved like a predator, closing the distance in a single, fluid motion. He didn't go for a weapon. He went for Jedediah. One of his hands clamped down on Jedediah's wrist, the sound of bone grating against bone audible even over the storm. The Colt went flying, landing with a splash in the mud. Elias's other hand, balled into a fist as hard as granite, drove deep into Jedediah's gut. The air left Jedediah in a whoosh. The two men became a blur of motion, grappling in the mud, their grunts and the sickening thud of fists landing on flesh and bone, the only sounds besides the storm. The good people of Dry Creek were no longer in their windows. They were standing on the boardwalk, soaked by the rain, their faces pale in the flickering lantern light. They were watching a battle that was about more than just two men. It was a battle for the soul of their town. Jedediah was bigger, fueled by whiskey and a lifetime of bullying. But Elias fought with the cold, brutal efficiency of the wilderness. Every move had a purpose. Every blow was meant to disable, to end the fight. Jedediah managed to break free, landing a wild punch that caught Elias on the jaw. Elias's head snapped back, but he took the blow as if he were made of stone. He answered with a quick, savage combination of strikes that sent Jedediah staggering backward, his face a mask of blood and surprise. This wasn't a man. This was a force of nature. With a final, desperate bellow, Jedediah charged. Elias didn't meet the charge head-on. He sidestepped, like a matador, using Jedediah's own momentum against him. He grabbed Jedediah's arm, twisted, and threw him face-first into the mud. Jedediah tried to get up. He pushed himself to his hands and knees, spitting mud and blood. The final blow was almost anticlimactic. A single, precise strike from Elias to the side of Jedediah's head. Jedediah collapsed without a sound, his face buried in the filth of the street he had terrorized for so long. Silence. The only sound was the drumming of the rain. Elias stood over the fallen man, his chest heaving. Rain washed the blood from a cut on his lip. He was a terrifying, magnificent figure, an avenging angel born of the storm. He turned and walked to where Abigail was still huddled on the ground. He didn't offer a hand. He just stood before her, a silent guardian, shielding her from the prying eyes of the town. "It's over," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "This man will not lay a hand on this woman again." Sheriff Dalton finally found his courage. He stepped off the boardwalk, his boots squelching in the mud. "Boone, you can't just—" "I can," Elias said, turning his cold gray eyes on the sheriff. "And I did. Or were you planning on stopping him, Sheriff? Tonight? Last week? Last year?" The sheriff had no answer. He looked at Jedediah's unconscious form, then at the silent, watching faces of the townsfolk. He saw the judgment in their eyes. His own cowardice was laid bare for all to see. It was a fair fight, Dalton mumbled, finally. Hayes drew on him first. We all saw it. A murmur of agreement went through the crowd. They had found their voices now that the danger was past. Elias turned back to Abigail. You should get inside. Get warm. It was Clara Morrison who spoke up, her voice trembling but clear. She can come with me. My house. Abigail looked at Clara, then at the other faces in the crowd. She saw shame and regret and a flicker of something new. Respect. Thank you, Clara, she said, her voice hoarse. But I'm going to my own house. She pushed herself to her feet, mud-caked and trembling, but unbroken. She started to walk, her spine as straight as an arrow. Elias fell into step beside her, a silent escort. At her door she turned to him. The rain was finally letting up, but their faces were still wet. Why? She whispered. Why did you come back? He looked out into the darkness for a long moment before answering. Because I ran once before, he said, his voice thick with an old pain. A long time ago. I let someone down. I let her die. My whole life since has been a kind of penance for that. He finally looked at her, and his storm-gray eyes were filled with a profound sorrow. I couldn't run again. I couldn't let his evil be the only thing in your world. A person deserves to know that kindness exists, even if they only see it once. He was talking about himself. He was talking about Sarah. He was talking about her. What will you do now? She asked. Jedediah will wake up, he said. He'll be full of rage and shame. He'll come for me. Or for you. I'll be waiting for him. He touched the brim of his hat. Get some rest, Abigail. He turned and melted back into the shadows, leaving her alone on her porch. Abigail went inside and barred the door. She stripped off her ruined dress and washed the mud from her skin. She built up the fire until the small cabin was warm and bright. Outside, the storm had broken. The world was washed clean. She took the small wooden bird from its hiding place and set it on the table. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in 8 years, she wasn't afraid of it. Jedediah was beaten, but not gone. The town was watching, and a quiet, dangerous man was keeping watch in the darkness. Everything had changed, and the story was far from over. The morning after the storm was unnaturally bright. The air scrubbed clean. Dry Creek was quiet, holding its breath. The news came just after sunrise, delivered by Sheriff Dalton himself. Jedediah wasn't at Doc Henley's, nursing a broken jaw. He wasn't in the town jail. He was gone. Sometime during the night, he had gathered his meager belongings, stolen a horse from the livery, and ridden out of town. No one saw him leave. He had vanished like a bad dream. Abigail received the news with a profound, bone-deep relief that was quickly followed by a prickle of unease. It was too easy. A man like Jedediah, a man whose entire identity was built on pride and intimidation, didn't just run away. He was a cornered animal, and cornered animals were the most dangerous. The town, however, celebrated. There was a lightness in the air, a sense of collective freedom. People spoke to Abigail on the street, their voices full of a respect she had never known. Clara Morrison brought over a freshly baked pie, and this time, she looked Abigail in the eye when she offered it. Abigail was no longer Jedediah's wife. She was Abigail Hayes, a survivor. She looked for Elias, but he was gone too. He had melted back into the hills, his job done. A part of her ached at his absence, but she understood. He was a man of the mountains, a ghost who had stepped into the light to settle a debt with his past and then retreated back into the shadows. She began to build a new life. She took in sewing and mending, her small, perfect stitches earning her a modest income. She planted a real garden, her calloused hands tending the new green shoots with a fierce tenderness. The little cabin, once a prison, began to feel like a home, but the fear never entirely went away. Every time a rider came into town, her heart would leap into her throat. Every time a dog barked in the night, she would find herself holding her breath, listening. Jedediah was out there, somewhere, and he was nursing a grudge that poison couldn't cure. Weeks turned into months. Spring arrived, painting the desert with a surprising palette of wildflowers. Abigail's life settled into a quiet rhythm. She made tentative friendships with Clara and some of the other women. She even found herself smiling sometimes, a strange and rusty feeling. She kept the wooden bird on her windowsill, a constant reminder of the man who had shown her that kindness still existed. She often found her eyes drifting to the jagged line of the mountains, wondering where he was, if he ever thought of her. The first sign of trouble came not from the desert, but from the east. A stranger rode into town, a man in a fancy city suit asking questions. He was a Pinkerton agent, and he was looking for a man named Elias Boone. The agent said Elias was wanted, not for brawling in a dusty town, but for murder. The murder of a prominent railroad baron named Theodore McKenna 7 years ago. The story was that Elias, a hunting guide, had robbed and killed McKenna's wife Sarah in a fit of greed. The town was stunned. The man they had hailed as a hero was a wanted killer? Sheriff Dalton, eager to redeem his reputation, was only too happy to help the Pinkerton. He formed a posse. They were going into the mountains to hunt Elias down, to bring him back for a hangman's noose. Abigail felt a cold dread wash over her. It was a lie. All of it. She knew with a certainty that defied logic that Elias was no killer. The man who had carved a delicate wooden bird for a broken woman was not a murderer. This was Jedediah's revenge. He hadn't come back with a gun. He'd come back with something far more dangerous. A lie. He must have heard the story of Sarah McKenna somewhere, twisted it, and fed it to the law. He couldn't beat Elias with his fists, so he was going to use a rope. Abigail had a choice. She could stay silent. She could let the town believe the lie. It was the safe thing to do. Elias was a ghost from her past. She owed him nothing more. But she remembered his words. A person deserves to know that kindness exists. He had saved her life. Now she had to save his. She went to Sheriff Dalton, but he wouldn't listen. He had a Pinkerton and a warrant. That was all the truth he needed. She knew what she had to do. She packed a small bag with food, water, and her sewing kit. In the dead of night, she slipped out of town. She didn't know the mountains like Elias did, but she knew the general direction he would have gone. She was going to find him. She was going to warn him. It was a fool's errand. A woman alone in the wilderness. But she was no longer the timid, beaten woman who flinched at shadows. She was Abigail Hayes, and she had wings. She just had to remember how to use them. The mountains were a harsh and unforgiving world. The sun beat down on her. The nights were freezing cold. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, but she pushed on, driven by a desperate urgency. After 2 days of searching, she found his camp. It was so well hidden, she almost walked right past it. A small, smokeless fire, a simple lean-to. He was there, skinning a rabbit. He looked up as she approached, his eyes widening in disbelief. He wasn't angry. He wasn't surprised. He just looked sad. "Abigail, you shouldn't be here. They're coming for you," she said, gasping for breath. "A posse, a Pinkerton agent. They say you murdered a woman named Sarah McKenna." The pain that flashed in his eyes was so profound it stole her breath. "Theodore," he whispered, "her husband. He must have done this." "It wasn't Theodore," she said, her voice shaking. "It was Jedediah. This is his revenge." Elias stood up, his face hardening into the granite mass she remembered. "I never touched Sarah. I tried to save her. Theodore. He was the one who killed her. He flew into a rage. She fell. I tried to stop him, but I was too late. He used his money to buy a story, and I ran. I've been running ever since." "We have to run now," Abigail urged. "We can disappear. Go somewhere they'll never find us." "No," Elias said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm done running. I ran from Theodore's lie 7 years ago. I won't run from Jedediah's now. A man can't outrun his ghosts, Abigail. Sooner or later, he has to turn and face them." From down the canyon, they heard the sound of barking dogs. The posse. They had found his trail. "You have to go," Elias said, grabbing her arm. "Go back to town. Tell them you got lost. They won't hurt you." "I'm not leaving you," she said, her chin set in that stubborn line he knew so well. "You are," he said, his voice gentle but absolute. "Your fight is over. This one is mine." He pulled the wooden bird from his own pocket. He had carved another one for himself. "Go live your life, Abigail. Be free. That's all the thanks I'll ever need." He pushed her toward a narrow game trail that led away from the camp. Go. Now. As she scrambled up the trail, she looked back. Elias was standing in the center of the clearing, not with a gun, but with his hands held out to his sides. He was not going to fight. He was going to face them. Abigail didn't run. She hid in the rocks overlooking the camp, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She watched as the posse, led by Sheriff Dalton and a sneering Jedediah, burst into the clearing. She saw them take Elias, saw them bind his hands. She saw the triumphant, hateful look on Jedediah's face, but she also saw something else. As they were leading Elias away, he looked up directly at the spot where she was hiding. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a nod of defeat. It was a nod of trust. He was trusting her to do what? And then she understood. He hadn't given up. He had a plan, and she was a part of it. He hadn't sent her away to save her. He had sent her away so she could be his witness, so she could finish the fight. Abigail scrambled down from the rocks and began the long journey back to Dry Creek. She was no longer just a survivor, she was a warrior, and she was going to burn Jedediah's lies to the ground. The trial was a spectacle. The whole territory was talking about it. The mountain man murderer, brought to justice by his own victim's vengeful husband. Jedediah was the star witness, spinning a tale of a savage killer who had preyed on an innocent woman. The Pinkerton agent provided the official story of the 7-year-old murder. It seemed like an open and shut case. Elias stood silent in the courtroom, his face unreadable. His lawyer, a young, inexperienced man appointed by the court, seemed utterly out of his depth. They were going to hang him. On the final day of the trial, just before the jury was set to deliberate, the courtroom doors swung open. Abigail Hayes walked in. She was wearing the blue dress. A gasp went through the courtroom. She walked to the witness stand, her steps steady, her eyes locked on Jedediah. His face went pale. "I have something to say," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity and strength no one had ever heard from her before. She told them everything. She told them about the years of abuse, the beatings, the humiliation. She told them about the night of the storm, how Elias had defended her when no one else would. And then she told them about the wooden bird, pulling the small, perfect carving from her pocket. "This is the man you call a murderer," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "A man who showed kindness to a stranger, a man who asked for nothing in return." Then she turned her eyes on Jedediah. "And this is the man you call a hero, a man who beat his wife in the street, a man whose jealousy and hatred are so deep he would see an innocent man hang just to satisfy his wounded pride." She looked at the jury. "The story of what happened 7 years ago is a story of 2 men, one with money and power, and one with nothing but his own guilt. But I am telling you the story of what happened here in Dry Creek. I am telling you that Elias Boone is not a killer. He is a good man. And Jedediah Hayes, he is the monster." A man stood up in the back of the courtroom. It was Tom Martinez, the boy from the feed store. "She's telling the truth. Jedediah cornered me, said he'd kill me if I ever looked at his wife again." Then Clara Morrison stood up. "He beat her for years. We all saw it. We were all too afraid to do anything. We were cowards." One by one, the people of Dry Creek stood up. The blacksmith, the mercantile owner, the Fletcher boy's father. They confessed their silence, their complicity. They became a chorus of truth, washing away years of lies. Sheriff Dalton, his face ashen, stood and arrested Jedediah for perjury and for the assault on Tom Martinez. The jury took 5 minutes. They found Elias Boone not guilty. The courtroom erupted. In the chaos, Elias and Abigail found each other. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. He simply took her hand, his rough palm covering hers. That evening, they stood on the hill overlooking the town, by the 3 small, unmarked graves. "What will you do now?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. "For the first time, I get to choose." "Theodore McKenna is still out there," he said. "His lie is still the official story." "Then maybe it's time someone told the truth," she replied, her eyes meeting his. He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that transformed his rugged face. "Maybe it is." He wasn't a man of towns, and she wasn't a woman of the wilderness. They were two broken people who had found a strange, unexpected wholeness in each other. Their future was as vast and uncertain as the desert sky, but they would face it together. The story of the drunk who beat his wife was over. The story of the hero who saved her was over. The story of Abigail and Elias, the woman with mended wings and the man who had finally faced his ghosts, was just beginning. Thank you for listening to this incredible story of survival and redemption. The tale of Abigail and Elias shows that even in the darkest of times, a single act of courage can change everything. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the wild heart of the American West. And we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. What part of Abigail's journey inspired you the most? Your support helps us keep these stories alive. Until next time, stay brave and keep fighting.